Hello, friends. Today I'm going to continue on with my William Adams readings, and let me immediately share what I want to read about. So, what or the actual document I want to read. Uh, okay, there we are. Um, it's the it's from the Transactions of the Japan Society of London, nowadays only known as the Japan Society. This one was the 149th Ordinary Meeting held in the hall at 20 Hanover Square West on Wednesday, the 9th of June, 1915. I've had a look on Google Maps, and apparently uh, this building is now a fashion academy. Anyway, it's still there, as I understand it, without any changes or perhaps it's been rebuilt after bombing, who knows? But anyway, there is certainly that address still exists. Held in the hall at 20 Hanover Square, Wednesday, the 9th of June, 1915, in the middle of the First World War, more than 110 years ago now, so I think this is out of copyright. If there are any problems, let me know. Uh, when a paper was read by Mr. C.J. Purnell, M.A., on the logbook of William Adams, Mr. Arthur Diosy, VPJS, Vice President of Japan Society, in the chair. Diosy was a Hungarian. He's quite an interesting man, I think. But today we are not going to talk about him in particular. But I think perhaps I should talk about or show you what I found about C.J. Purnell. If I can just find the other one I wanted to share. It's a web page from the National Portrait Gallery. There we are. Christopher James Purnell, 1878 to 1959, librarian of the London Library, and he was a sitter in one portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. There he is. And he's in the category of literature, journalism, and publishing, London. Yeah, okay, so there he is. In later years, obviously, then, if we click on the photo, we can get, it says unable to open. All right, fair enough. But anyway, we found a photograph of him, and we could actually, oops, no. Can we do anything with that? Nope. All right, that's enough of that then. So at the time when he read this paper that I'm about to read to you, he was indeed the sub-librarian of the London Library. And yes, the building, 20 Hanover Square, I've just made some notes here. It's now JCA London Fashion Academy, a fashion design school, and you can find it on London maps. It's in Mayfair in London. Okay. An area which I know a little bit because I briefly, just after university, lived for a short time in Mayfair. Don't ask me about that. Well, you could ask me, but anyway, it's not relevant to this, so on we go. Back to the share of the, let me see. There we are. The share of what I want to read. So let's take that as read now and move on. Yeah, it's volume 13 of the Transactions of the Japan Society. And the page number, as you can see, is 156 there. I think I'm going to read about, how many pages? I think it's 30 pages. All right. So I shall start now. The Logbook of William Adams, 1614 to 19. Two papers have already been read before the Japan Society on William Adams. The first by Mr. Arthur Diosy, or Diosy, I'm not quite sure. The second by Lord Redesdale, that's A.B. Mitford. These dealt with Adams's account of his adventurous voyage to Japan and of his early years there, and gave a character sketch of the famous pilot with an estimation of the value of his services. The information given in these papers has not been repeated here, except as regards the main facts. Adams's logbook, now Saville manuscript 48 in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, consists of 79 leaves, measuring 14 7/8 times 10 1/4 inches. It is in 3 sections, of which the first, containing the record of the voyage to the Ryukyu Islands, that's Okinawa and surrounding islands, is on smooth Japanese paper, the writing being neat with fine strokes. The paper of the second section is also Japanese, but rather porous, and the writing in consequence is larger and not so neat. The paper of the third section resembles that of the first, but the writing continues as in the second section. Rough calculations of expenses and loans, as well as nautical observations scattered about the manuscript, show that it is Adams's original diary and not a copy. His name does not occur in the log, but the writing is similar to that of his letters. 2 small outline drawings, one of a burning island near the Ryukyu Islands and the other of the southern portion of the Goto Islands, illustrate the text. The manuscript seems to have been unbound till about 1900, when it was put into cloth boards. How it came into the possession of Sir Henry Saville, whose collection was bequeathed to the University of Oxford, is unknown. That's Saville, S-A-V-I-L-E. The other documents printed as appendixes are for the most part preserved in the India Office Library. Now we have 2 footnotes. These are references to, first Diosy's talk and then Redesdale's talk. So Diosy's talk can be found in Japan Society's Transactions, Volume 6, page 325, and I presume it's more than 1 page, but who knows? Doesn't say where the final page is. Perhaps it is just 1 page. And then Ibid, Japan Society's Transactions, the same thing. Ibid means from the same place. Volume 8, page 3. So that is as regards Lord Redesdale's paper. Can't imagine either paper would have been just 1 page, but there we are. I'm investigating that right now. Hopefully get hold of their papers. Adams was born in 1564 at Gillingham in Kent. The entry of his baptism in the clearly written parish register being as follows: William Adams, son of John Adams, baptized the 24th of September 1564. From his own letters, often reprinted, we know that at the age of 12 he was apprenticed for 12 years to Nicholas Diggins, a shipbuilder at Limehouse. He served as master and pilot in Her Majesty's ships, and at the time of the Spanish Armada was captain of a 120-ton ship, the Richard Duffield, which, with a crew of 70, carried victuals westwards to Drake's fleet. Then for 11 or 12 years he served the company of Barbary merchants till the Indian traffic from Holland began. Being desirous to make a little experience of the knowledge which God had given him, he hired himself in 1598 as pilot major of a fleet of 5 sail, which set out from the Texel under the command of Jacques Mahu. Texel, I think, is in Netherlands. Their intention was to reach the East Indies through the Straits of Magellan, but the voyage was a disastrous one. The various accounts by Dutch survivors of this expedition do not show why Adams was transferred from the Hoop, on which, according to his letters, he was pilot major, to the Liefde. Early in the voyage, some of the pilots had been negligent, so that 4 of the ships nearly ran aground off the coast of Barbary. That's Morocco area, I think. But the admiral's vessel, on which Adams was, kept well off the coast. It was then resolved that each captain should compare the bearings of his pilot with the maps twice, or at least once a week, and discuss the position one with another. The Liefde alone reached Beppu Bay in Japan on April 19, 1600, only Adams and 6 others of the 24 survivors of the crew being able to stand on their feet. Their adventures during the voyage and their treatment on arrival may be read in the previous papers, the ones already mentioned by Diosy and Mitford or Redesdale, or in Adams's letters. It is sufficient now to state that Adams was released from prison and received into favor by the shogun Ieyasu. All right, and we've got two footnotes here. First one refers back to Drake's fleet, Richard Duffield, carrying victuals for Drake's fleet. This is from State Papers, Elizabeth, 215 CCXV, 76 etc. Also Harleian manuscript 168, folio 178, which gives the crew as 25. And then a second footnote referring to what? I can find it. Where is it? Oh, the Liefde. Right. That's it, the Liefde. Nachod in his Beziehungen der Niederland, Ostindische Kompanie zu Japan, 1897, page 99, discusses the question as to which ship arrived in Japan and concludes that it was the Liefde. Yeah, I think that's generally understood to be the case now. All right, I'll read the last sentence at the bottom again. It is sufficient now to state that Adams was released from prison and received into favor by the shogun Ieyasu, for whom later he built two seaworthy ships. He also instructed him in geometry and mathematics, receiving in return a yearly stipend and an estate at Hemi. The logbook throws no light on the first 14 years of his residence in Japan, but some facts which have not appeared in previous English accounts have been gathered from other sources. The Jesuit Pasio, in his annual letter of 1605, mentions that certain Franciscans, with a desire to please the shogun, promised to get some of the vessels from the Philippines to call at Yedo, now Tokyo, but the captains and pilots made excuse that the harbour was not suitable for their purpose and difficult of access. The shogun was angry at their repeated excuses, and the Franciscans then offered to have the latest arrival towed up if the shogun bore the expenses. At this point, Adams offered to pilot the ship up without the aid of barks, which convinced the shogun that the Spaniards' excuses were not valid. An attempt was shortly afterwards made to persuade Adams and his companions to leave Japan, as the following extract from the same letter shows. In Yedo, there were living 7 or 8 heretics, English and Dutch, who had arrived a few years ago in a vessel which the shogun had retained, keeping the men at Yedo. The father spoke to the principal one of them, i.e. Adams, and offered to procure for him and his companions a safe conduct if they would leave Japan. This he did for fear that they would infect the Japanese converts tender in the Catholic faith with their perverse doctrines, Protestantism, of course. But the Englishman did not accept the offer, pleading that the shogun, for various reasons, would not give his consent. He thanked the father, however, who then tried to show him the error of his sect and the truth of the Catholic religion by arguments taken from the Holy Bible. But he only wasted time with the obstinate heretic, who was a man of fine spirit and, without having been a student, tried to prove his errors by the authority of the same scripture wrongly interpreted. We have a footnote reference. Convinced the shogun that the Spaniards' excuses were not valid. And then this is from Lettres annales du Japon, 1603-6, envoyé par F. Pasio, Lyon, 1609, page 211. So Adams tried to prove the errors of the father by the authority of the same scripture wrongly interpreted, and though obliged to submit to the force and truth of the Jesuits' reasons, he persisted in his obstinate opinion. So he wasn't going to be converted to Catholicism, is what we gather from that. Adams would not be. It is interesting to notice that in 1605, Adams, according to his own letter, applied unsuccessfully to the shogun for permission to leave Japan. Later, a Franciscan tried to convert Adams, talking with him on the seashore at Uraga. He sought to prove the truth of the Catholic religion by means of the miracles which its adherents could perform. Adams told him that he did not believe in present-day miracles. Not that he stood in doubt, but that the power of God was able to do them, and greater matters too, but that he firmly believed that all miracles ceased long since. The missionary said that he himself would perform one and gave the Dutchman his choice. The latter challenged him to walk on the sea as St. Peter had done, and the challenge was accepted. Oh dear. At the time appointed, a great crowd of Japanese assembled, and the missionary addressed them through an interpreter. Then, holding a large wooden crucifix sufficient to have kept up any reasonable swimmer, as this man was well known to be, he stepped into the sea. Instead of walking on it, he had to be rescued by Melchior van Zandvoort, and had not only to suffer the ridicule of the unbelievers, but was recalled from Japan and imprisoned at Manila by the bishop for his rash attempt. Okay, so yeah, there's a long footnote here talking about the rash attempt, I think it is, in rather older English. Goes all the way. Yeah, it's from the Public Record Office CO, which I think is Colonial Office 77. CO. CO 77, East Indies, Volume 1, Folio 43, extract from Cox's letter to T. Wilson, December 10th, 1614. Anyway, I'm not going to read all of that. It's quite challenging English anyway. All right, back to the main. Yeah, okay, so he was imprisoned at Manila by the bishop for his rash attempt to walk on water. Cox adds, others to this day cannot forget so notable a miracle monger. Indeed, I can be hard to forget that. That's from a letter to T. Wilson, December 10th, 1614. See also Charlevoix, Histoire, etc. du Japon. Okay. There is in the Rijkarchief at the Hague a contemporary copy of a letter written in February 1608 by Victor Sprinckel, who was then head of the Dutch factory at Patani. This letter was sent to Adams by means of Melchior van Zandvoort and gives the reasons why Dutch ships had not reached Japan sooner in response to the shogun's license, which had been sent by the hands of Queckerneck and van Zandvoort in 1605. These two men had formed part of the crew of the Liefde, the former being captain during the latter part of the voyage. At the entreaty of Adams, they had been allowed to leave Japan in 1605, and the daimyo of Hirado had provided a ship for their journey to Siam, Thailand, modern Thailand. Their subsequent history can be read in Sato's Introduction to the Voyage of Saris and in Nachod's Beziehungen. So I'm focusing mainly on Sato's introduction at the moment as the main part of my presentation. Coming up, when the two ships, the Rode Löwe, met Pilen, the Red Lion with arrows, and the Griffin arrived at Hirado. Oops, sorry. In 1609, Van Zandvoort accompanied the chief merchants as interpreter on their journey to the court of Ieyasu. And we've got a footnote there. See what that says. Ieyasu continued to act as shogun until his death in 1616, though he nominally retired in favor of Hidetada in 1605. Okay, so he was a kind of regent. It does not appear what part Adams played on the occasion of this visit. But from the way in which he helped the Dutch 2 years later, it may be assumed that his influence was brought to bear in their favour at this time. It is natural that he should have abstained from magnifying his services to the Dutch in his letters home, which he hoped would bring the English company, the East India Company, into competition for the trade with Japan. Of Adams's share in bringing about the success of the second visit of the Dutch to the court of Ieyasu in 1611, it is possible to speak with certainty. A translation of the Journal of the Ambassadors is given in volume 7 of the Recueil des Voyages. The Braque, that's the ship's name, the Braque anchored off Hirado on July the 1st, and 4 days later, a letter was sent to Adams asking him to wait for the embassy at Suruga, Shizuoka. He was informed that the Dutch had need of his counsel and credit with regard to the requests which they had to make of the emperor. The narrator adds that this Mr. Adams had obtained such favour with this monarch that no lord nor prince of the country had better, because he had much spirit, experience, and sincerity. He often conversed with the emperor, and had ready access to his presence, a favour which was accorded to few people only, and is of great value to those who obtain it. Emperor, of course, in this case is the shogun, not the emperor. Mention is also made of the purchase by Don Rodrigo of the ship which Adams built at the shogun's command. On August the 16th, Adams met the party and they entered Suruga together. And on the same evening, he called on Ieyasu's secretary, Kozuke no Suke, called by the English Codskin Dono or Codskin, Codskin, who promised to help the Dutch. Hang on, August the 16th of which year are we talking here? 1611, I think. Yes. Codskin. Kozuke no Suke became Codskin in English. The members of a Spanish embassy had arrived a few days earlier and were waiting for an interview with Ieyasu. When at last they obtained one, Adams was present as interpreter and succeeded in convincing Ieyasu that the Spaniards' ignorance of the treaty between Spain and the Netherlands was only pretended from some hidden design. Their object was to persuade the ex-shogun and his ministers that the Dutch were not really merchants, but had come to plunder the Spaniards and Portuguese. The smallness of the cargo of the Braque lent colour to this assertion. Adams, however, assured Goto Shozaburo, the mint master, who broached the subject, that this was false, and that the Dutch would be found better merchants and fairer in their dealings than the Spaniards or Portuguese. So at this time you've got the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the English, so all sort of vying with each other rather bitterly for Japanese trade. The Dutch ambassadors had sent presents to Kozuke no Suke, who told Adams that the latter ought to have warned the Dutch against doing so, as he never received presents. Adams, however, persuaded him to retain them, saying that the presents were not worth mentioning and that it would be for the honour of the Dutch nation if he kept them. This he ultimately did, to the astonishment of the Japanese and the envy of the Spaniards whose presents had been returned. On August the 17th, the Dutch were favourably received in audience by Ieyasu, that's August 17, 1611, who promised to consider their requests. After they had retired, Adams was recalled, and Ieyasu examined the presents, asked further questions, and finally expressed approval of the Dutch merchandise. Sorry if you can hear a police siren in the background. Adams then accompanied the Dutch to Yedo, whither they went on his advice to visit Ieyasu's son Hidetada. They bore a letter from Kozuke no Suke to his father, Sodo no Kami, who was Hidetada's secretary. The latter returned his compliments and promised to obtain an audience with Hidetada. This he did on the day after their arrival, August 23rd, 1611, the Dutch in the meantime having passed the night in a house belonging to Adams. More presents were given and received, visits were paid and returned, and the party set out again on the 25th, spending the night at a house of Adams at Uraga. Here they found the Spanish ambassador, who sent 2 or 3 of his soldiers to pay them his compliments, to which the Dutch responded none too cordially, it would appear. Having arrived once more at Suruga, Shizuoka, on the 29th, Adams went to see whether the passports were ready and to give to Kozuke no Suke letters from his father. From Kozuke no Suke's father, that is. The passports were ready on the 30th, and Adams handed them to the Dutch on the 31st. The special request of the latter to be free from the visits of the inspectors when unloading their vessels had been passed over, which necessitated a fresh visit to Ieyasu's secretary, who tried to persuade the Dutch to let the matter drop, saying that he would give a verbal command that their wish should be carried out and that they would always have the help of Adams. Not satisfied with this, they wrote out a fresh request, which Adams succeeded in getting placed before Ieyasu, who granted their demands, gave them a sealed license, that would be a shuinjo, and allowed Adams to accompany them to their ship. This Adams did, calling in company with the Dutch factor Specx, S-P-E-C-X, on Itakura, the governor of Kyoto, who also was persuaded by Adams to accept a present from the Dutch. On September 19, 1611, they reached Hirado, and Adams with Specx went to visit the old and new daimyos. To this period belongs the conversation between Ieyasu and Adams with regard to the desire of the Spaniards to make soundings in the harbour of Japan. The occasion was the arrival in 1611 at Yedo of a Spanish ship, the captain of which had asked and received permission to make soundings in the harbour, the ostensible reason being the need of knowing the coast in case of storms. Ieyasu afterwards asked whether European countries allowed foreigners to do this off their coasts, and Adams replied that, on the contrary, to do so constituted an act of war, and he added that probably the Spaniards had designs on the kingdom of Japan. He went on to say that their missionaries were spies and were undermining the loyalty of the natives to their own rulers in order to facilitate the conquest of the island by the Spaniards. For this reason, the rulers of Germany, England, and the Netherlands would not allow priests to enter their countries. Ieyasu replied that, if this were so, it would not be strange if he who was of a different religion should drive out these men when rulers of a similar religion would not suffer them. Adams tried to point out that although the Protestant religion was fundamentally the same as that of the Spaniards, the latter had made alterations in the faith which the Protestants had preserved in its purity. Certainly the latter would not use their religion as a cloak under which to attack their neighbours. There's the reference. The conversation between Ieyasu and Adams is found in Charlevoix, Histoire du Japon, Volume 5, 1736, and Lettera Annua del Giappone del 1612, Roma 1615, page 10. Nevertheless, although the Spaniards and Portuguese had done their best to poison the shogun's mind against Adams and the Dutch on their arrival in 1600, Adams seems to have tried, to use his own words, to recompense them good for evil, and it is reported of him that he was always on good terms with the Spaniards, assisting them willingly and receiving them into his house when they were sick, although this afterwards brought upon him the suspicion of Hidetada. On the subject of religion, however, he was intractable, and both Charlevoix and Pages lay the blame on him for the expulsion of Roman Catholics from Japan, although Rodriguez Girau, the writer of the 1612 annual letter, while blaming the heretic English pilot, Adams, practically admits that there were other reasons. The political activity of the Jesuits and their converts was no doubt the chief cause of their final expulsion. In the meantime, one or more of Adams' letters had reached England, and the East India Company had decided to send a ship to Japan. The following extracts from John Jourdain's diary, April 16th and 22nd, 1613, give some idea of the difficulties of getting English letters through to their destination. 2 men from a Dutch vessel came aboard his ship at Amboina. They told us news of Mr. Adams, which was in Japan in great credit with the king and was desirous of English ships to come thither, and as they said he had wrote a letter and an English sailor which was in their ship to Mr. Spalding for Bantam, and had the letter in great secret, and to deliver it unto no man's hand but his. Later Jourdain sent a messenger to one of the ships to buy bread, there finding an Englishman in the ship which came from Mr. Adams from Japan, directed to Mr. Spalding at Bantam. That was the chief factor at Bantam, with a draft of the country of Japan. Peter Floris, a Dutchman in the English Company's service, who had arrived at Patani on the globe, also throws light on the means of communication. On July 3rd, 1612, he notes in his journal, departed the Dutch pinnace, the Greyhound. All right, so we've got various references here. Paget's Histoire de la religion chrétienne au Japon, Volume 2, page 172. Murdoch and Yamagata, History of Japan, 1542 to 1651, 1903, pages 492, etc. That's James Murdoch, I think. India Office, China Materials, Japan Supplement, Volume 1, pages 13, etc. And India Office Floris's Journal, page 36. That's the one at the bottom of the page. So on July 3rd, 1612, he notes in his journal, departed the Dutch pinnace, the Greyhound, for Japan, with which we sent the letters of the Comp and other particular persons to Mr. William Adam, which came as fit for us as ever anything could happen. Mr. Skinner made acquaintance with the master's mate of the pinnace. That's a small ship. Pinnace in English, Pinnace, but here spelled Pinnasse. And was even the very same man which had brought the, what's that? First? Premier? I'm not sure. From Mr. Adams to Bantam to the Englishmen there, whereof himself was very kind, as having an occasion to do a kindness to Mr. Adam, to whom he was beholding, promising to deliver the letter to his own hands. In accordance with the company's instructions, Captain John Saris, in command of the Clove, arrived at Hirado in 1613, and Adams was at once summoned. Okay, so this is where Sato comes in with his account, or his edited account of, or edition of John Saris's journal, I should say. The story of their meeting and the subsequent voyage to the court of Ieyasu, as well as the misunderstandings which arose between them, have been told in the previous papers and may also be read in The Voyage of Captain John Saris, which is what I've been doing. An account of the negotiations and the agreement entered into by Adams with the East India Company are also given in Volume 1 of Letters Received by the East India Company. Saris left orders that Adams should go as master of a junk to Siam in March 1614, while Peacock was to go as captain, but Cox, who had been appointed chief merchant in Japan, made better use of Adams by sending him in company with Richard Wickham to establish branch factories, trading outposts in Edo and elsewhere. Cox's advice to the latter is instructive. Writing in January 1614, he requests Wickham to give Captain Adams content with kind speeches, and adds that he is persuaded he could live 7 years with Adams before any extraordinary speeches should happen between them. Again, writing to the East India Company, he says of Adams, I find the man tractable and willing to do your worships the best service he may. So Cox and Adams seem to have got on quite well. Cox being appointed the chief factor in Hirado, chief agent of the company. And there we've got some references. Saris, in his farewell letter to Cox, Saris, on the other hand, did not get on well with Adams, it seems. Saris, in his farewell letter to Cox, mentioned that he had had intolerable trouble with Wickham, who seldom remained long on good terms with his associates. His letters show his attitude towards Adams. He was suspicious of others, though not above suspicion himself. In February, Cox was alarmed by a rumour of Adams' death, which a lying friar or Jesuit had reported, but a letter received shortly afterwards from Adams reassured him. A new difficulty compelled Cox to write to Adams for advice and assistance. The old king of Hirado, that would be the daimyo. Yes, exactly. Footnote says daimyo. The old king or daimyo of Hirado, Foin-sama, that's Hoin-sama. Foin-sama is the English Foin-same, Sami, the English rendition of Hoin-sama, had early in March ordered the English flag to be hauled down on account of the cross which it contained. Yeah, Hoin was Matsura Hoin, yes. Cox tried to explain that it was only the emblem of the nation and had no religious signification, but without avail. English flag to be hauled down. Yeah. He accordingly wrote to Adams to ask the shogun why the English might not fly their colours as well as the Dutch. Apparently, Adams was unsuccessful in his appeal, for Cox, writing to him on June the 5th, says that the English flag had been taken down by the Emperor's orders. That surely would be the daimyo's orders, because it had a cross in it and it had not been set up again. Okay, so almost sounds quite modern, this problem, doesn't it? Taking down the flag with a St. George's cross. But this time it's because it has a cross in it, so it sounds like it's a Christian flag, I suppose. In the meantime, Peacock and Caerwarden left on March the 18th in a junk for Cochin China, whence they never returned. Cochin China, I think, is Vietnam or thereabouts. Whence they never returned, and the first enterprise of any importance undertaken by the English factory at Hirado ended disastrously. In July, Adams returned with Edward Saris or Sayers to Hirado. Cox had been waiting for him to look out for a junk, and Adams wasted no time on his arrival, for, writing to Wickham on July 25th, he says, "I am about a junk to proceed in, and if it shall please God for Siam, which I hope about 3 months hence I shall be ready to depart." Cox, also writing to Wickham on the same day, speaks of the junk and says that either Wickham or Eton should go in her. A goshun was obtained from Ieyasu in Adams's Japanese name, Anjin or pilot. Okay, we've got some notes here. Including Asiatic Society of Japan Transactions, Volume 13, page 141. Sato. Good. This junk was bought in August 1614 for 2,000 taels, and 2,312 taels, 9 mace, 5 kandareens were also spent in fitting her out. Okay, let's take a look at the footnote there. Taels and kandareens. 1 tael equals 10 mace equals 100 kandareens, about 6 shillings, or according to Cox, 5 shillings. Good. In spite of this, she was not very seaworthy. And it was only Cox's assurance that Adams was not the sort of man to risk his life unnecessarily that induced Wickham to trust himself on her. The junk was named the Sea Adventure, and her first voyage, intended for Siam, was not a success. She afterwards made 3 more voyages to Siam, Adams being in charge of the first and William Eaton of the other 2. The latter, on his second arrival in Siam in December 1618, after a perilous voyage, sold the old junk and bought another. Adams weighed anchor on November 28th, but did not get clear away from Kawachi, where he had been sheltering till December 17th. Wickham went as Cape merchant and Edward Saris as his assistant. There were also several Japanese merchants on board, including Groby Dono. A list of the merchandise carried for barter is printed in Ries's History of the English Factory at Hirado, but for the purchase of the things required from Siam, Brazil wood, deerskins, raw silk, etc., about £1,250 was carried. Ries was Professor Ries of Tokyo Imperial University. Sato had some dealings with him as well. On the second day at sea, the junk had to run before a gale, there being a great sea, so that, as Wickham says, the mercy of God exceeded our misery, or else we had never seen land again. The junk sprung a leak, and it was decided to make for the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, as the hostility of the Chinese prevented them from refitting in China. Oshima was reached, that must be Amami Oshima, surely, Oshima was reached on the 22nd, but this island was not deemed suitable for refitting the junk. So once more they set sail and arrived at Naha in Okinawa in the Great Ryukyu, Okinawa Shima, the island of Okinawa, on the 27th. The king's permission was obtained to land the stores, but great difficulty was experienced in procuring the things needful. For refitting the junk. Wickham says that this was due to the officials' desire to make them lose the monsoon. Yet Adams, writing 2 years later, says, "We found marvellous great friendship. Anxious and weary days were spent here by Adams. First, there was the dilatoriness of the officials ashore. Then bad material was supplied for caulking the ship, so preventing it from sinking by putting caulk. I think it's a kind of waterproofing. Next, the sailors got out of hand and demanded that their wages should be paid in advance. Adams refused, but the merchants, fearful of losing their voyage, begged him to comply with their demands, and at last he had to yield. Wickham and Damian also fell out and did fight together. They were not reconciled till 30 days later. In the meantime, the governors of Ryukyu, Okinawa, became anxious that the junk should depart, if only for Oshima. They gave as their reason that the junk from China was expected in about 3 months' time, and if the Chinese found rivals they would not come again, which would cause great loss to the islanders. Adams nobly replied that he was but one, and did not care where he died, whether there or in the sea, but he prayed them to have compassion on the 120 or 130 passengers and seamen. Then the merchants and seamen quarrelled and rose up in arms to have fought with one another, but by my great persuasion, Mr. Wickham and Sir Edward Saris, Edward Saris, did so persuade on both sides, as there was no bloodshed of no party, thanks be to Almighty God for ever. Amen. The danger was great, as Groby Dono, with 16 or 20 of his men, armed with pikes, swords, bows, and arrows, came to challenge the sailors, of whom there were about 40 present. At last the chief man of Shuri, where the king's palace was, that's in Naha on Okinawa Island, came to try and settle the difference, and peace was made on March the 15th. In spite of this, Adams writes on the 26th that he that had been the cause of the great mutiny, being still foul of desperate parts this night, Groby Dono killed him. Enforced idleness was very irksome to Adams, and the description of himself as doing nothing but walk melancholy. Okay, so this is a footnote at the bottom here. I think it's for, Wickham and Damian. Okay, so Damian, who was he? Damian Marin, a Portuguese who was afterwards made prisoner at Nagasaki by his fellow countrymen for having served with the English. A special command for his release had to be obtained from Ieyasu by Adams. Okay, back to the main text at the bottom of the page. Enforced idleness was very irksome to Adams, and the description of himself as doing nothing but walk melancholy and move solitary is pathetic. The king sent him an invitation to see the city of Shuri, a privilege which Basil Hall, 200 years later, tried in vain to obtain, but Adams replied that if he could not obtain the favour to trim his ship, the sight of the city was no pleasure to him. The misbehaviour of his crew was also a continual cause of trouble to Adams, and he had much difficulty in saving the lives of 2 of the men who had been condemned to death for stealing, etc. Then the carpenters refused to get the pumps ready till the quartermaster was reinstated. Adams had also to appeal to the authorities to compel his crew to go on board, and then had to advance more money to pay their debts ashore. All this time he was in anxiety on account of news brought by junks from Satsuma in Kyushu of the war between Ieyasu and Hideyori at Osaka. Although he had heard on January 21st, 1615, that the emperor had got the victory, of which news I was glad, yet a rumour reached him in May that the emperor is like to lose his country, so he delayed a few days longer in order to have an interview with some officials from Satsuma, southern Kyushu, who had brought the latest news. Yeah, I think again, emperor here is the shogun. Yeah. On May the 4th, Wickham and Adams had some words in chiding manner, and 3 days later, the former charged Adams with not doing his best for the owner's profits. Damian denied having made the offer that Wickham alleged, and Adams cleared himself in the presence of Edward Saris, John Spaniard de Lievana, and Damian. This serves to illustrate the suspicious character of Wickham. I think that's Richard Wickham, yeah, although it is much more probable that he, rather than Adams, was working for his own interests. Yeah, Wickham was an employee of the East India Company, a factor, I think, so an agent. At last, Adams set sail with a cargo of wheat and ambergris, which he had bought from some junks of Miyakoshima, and anchored in Kawachi Harbor on June the 10th. One of the results of this voyage was the introduction into Japan of the sweet potato from the Ryukyu Islands. Cox, Volume 1, page 11. But the voyage from a commercial point of view was a failure. Following the narrative of this voyage are accounts of sums lent to various members of the ship's company and notes of Adams' expenditure in the Ryukyu, etc., which incidentally illustrate the low value of the Luchuan cash, or gens, as he calls them. Gen, I suppose that's yen, isn't it? 3,300 or 4,000 going to the mas, or sixpence. There are also examples of Ryukyuan words, and sentences evidently written down to enable Adams to be polite to the officials of the island. Many of the words are unrecognizable. Adams's first log ends at June the 24th, 1615, but from Cox's diary we learn that he remained at Kawachi superintending the trimming of the junk, though he visited Hirado continually and helped to secure passports for Eton. He incurred Cox's displeasure by taking the part of Cuemon Dono, alias Zanzibar, in a quarrel about the interpreter Gorson, and it was on this occasion, July 30th, that Cox wrote that Adams still esteemeth him, i.e. Cuemon Dono, more than all our English nation, and still he would pawn his life and soul for his honesty. And I cannot choose but note it down that he is much more friend to the Dutch than to the Englishmen, which are his own countrymen. God forgive him. That's Cox. Cox's writing there. Richard Cox. He then proceeds to complain that the company was cheated of 400 or 500 taels by Cuemon Dono and others in the purchase of the Sea Adventure, although, he adds, Captain Adams have no hand in the matter, for with their smooth speeches they make a child of him, and so do what they list, what they like. On August the 3rd, however, Cox heard that Adams was ill and visited him on August the 18th. This is 1615, yes. 4 days later, Adams came to Hirado and raged against Cox's interpreter, alleging that he was the occasion of the carpenters' strike. Here he was again taken ill with fever and vomiting. A month later, Adams received a letter purporting to come from Ieyasu demanding his presence. Cox suspected that he had arranged the matter in order to be released from the company's service, but Adams said that he thought the emperor wished to hear about a fortress newly built in the Ryukyu, where it was suspected that Hideyori might retire after his defeat. Cox, Volume 1, page 49. It was arranged that Adams should accompany Ralph Copindall, captain of the Osiander, which had just arrived from England, on his complimentary visit to Ieyasu. They set out in 3 barks on September 11th, 1615, expecting to find the ex-shogun at Miyako, that's Kyoto, but he had left for Yedo, Tokyo, and Adams went post-haste after him, having received a further urgent commission from Cox to use his influence on behalf of Juan de Lievana and Damian Marin, who had been put in prison by the Portuguese at Nagasaki for serving with the English. The writer of a fragmentary account of the first part of this journey, now in the British Museum, Egerton Manuscript 21, complains that Adams, in his bark, went on ahead so that the rest did not see him for 2 or 3 days. When they overtook him, Copendale invited him to dinner and afterwards mildly remonstrated with him. In the meantime, the repairing of the Sea Adventure had been completed, in spite of the dilatoriness of the carpenters, and she was towed into the harbour of Hirado on October the 14th, and her mast set up on October 27th, at which ceremony all the town assisted, bringing presents. On November 6th, Cox heard that Copendale had been well received by Ieyasu and that the latter had sent Adams to inquire of some padres at Yedo why they had come into his dominions against his orders. The ex-shogun also asked Adams wherefore there was such hatred betwixt the Spaniards and Hollanders, for that it was told him their princes and governors were friends in all other parts of the world, and that it seemed strange to him that they should be enemies here. Unto which Mr. Adams answered that it was true they had been friends of late years per means of the King of England and other potentates, but yet, notwithstanding, the King of Spain did think himself to have more right in these parts of the world than any other Christian prince, by reason of the footing he had gotten in the Filipinas and in other parts of the Indies, and therefore perforce meant to keep all other nations from trading into these parts. Unto which the emperor replied and said, the Spaniard was in the wrong, and therefore, seeing it was a difference or dispute amongst us which were all strangers, he would not make nor meddle in the matter, but leave it to their princes to decide at home. But, said he, what is the occasion they take men as well as goods? Because, said Mr. Adams, the Spaniards take the Hollanders, and have 150 or 200 of them prisoners in the Philippines, for which occasion the Hollanders do use the like towards their people, man for man and goods for goods. Unto which the emperor answered that they had reason. Excuse me. On the 27th, Adams returned to Hirado, bringing letters from Ieyasu ordering the release of Lievana and Damian, which was therefore accomplished to the great heart's grief, both of the Spaniards and Portuguese, they having condemned them both to death. Another small service which Adams was called upon to perform was the investigation of a charge against the reputation of one of the women at the English house. He so handled the matter that the accuser's knavery was found out, and the writer of the letter asked her forgiveness. Cox for a time thought of sending Adams to Yedo to be near the emperor always, but Adams, though agreeing at first, changed his mind as he had so lately taken leave of the emperor, and it was decided that he should proceed with his voyage. Excuse me. Accordingly, the Sea Adventure, being strong and well repaired, although to the company's great charge, started on December the 6th on its second attempt to reach Siam, Adams being again in charge with Saris as agent. Cox delivered to Adams £600, whereof £40 10 was in Faibuk, refined silver, of Tsushima, and the rest in reals of 8, which maketh 2,400 taes. The record of this voyage is wanting from Adams' logbook, but some of the accounts of expenses refer to it. Saris's journal is extant in Marine Records number 24 of the India Office, and the more important items from it are printed in Appendix number 4. The voyage was uneventful with the exception of a great gale, in which they lost their pump overboard while seas came in on both sides. They entered the river of Siam, Menam, on January the 10th, 1616, and proceeded to Bangkok, whither the ubiquitous Goby Dono had preceded them. The next day, Saris, I think this is Edward Sayers, it's not John Saris, who's gone home, never to return to Japan. He went home in 1613, did he not? All right, so this is a bit confusing, I fear. But anyway, the next day, Saris borrowed a boat of the governor in which to go to Miyako, or capital, then Ayutthaya, to visit the king. That's a place just north of Bangkok. I have actually been there. He was followed 7 days later by Adams, who brought the junk to Ayutthaya, where there was already a factory of the East India Company. On the 24th, Adams gave the customary present to the king. It consisted of 1 katana, or sword, 3 lances, and 1 Sude, or box for a looking glass. Ceuday. They obtained the necessary passport, and Saris sold all the Inde cloth to Jeremy Lee. The Sea Adventure was not large enough to carry all their purchases of wood and skins, so Saris chartered another junk of which he took charge. The Japanese captain and many others died on this boat during a perilous voyage home, but Saris showed extraordinary resourcefulness and ultimately reached Japan. A third junk was also dispatched under command of Captain Shobik. Adams arrived at Kawachi on July the 22nd, 1616, and other junks later. This expedition was the most successful of all the ventures of the Hirado factory, Adams bringing back in the Sea Adventure 2,350 picols of Siam wood and 3,700 deer skins, for which more than double the cost price was realized. This was in addition to the cargo of the two other junks. The necessary present on their return was carried to the King of Hirado, that's the daimyo, by Adams on July 24th, but the king was ill and could not see him. A week later, Cox and Adams set out by water to go to Edo via Shimonoseki. They reached Osaka on August the 5th and proceeded by land, though they attempted to cross Ise Bay by barks. Small boats. Near Edo, two of Adams' tenants of Hemi met them with presents of food and wine. Adams then went on and prepared his house at Edo for the reception of Cox, who records that Adams now began to see that his brother-in-law, Andrea, was playing the knave with him. He is a crafty knave, is his estimation of the latter. Ieyasu had died on June the 1st, 1616, and the Spaniards were again trying to prejudice the shogun Hidetada against the English, saying that they rob and steal from all they meet at sea. Adams informed the court officials that the captured ships were Portuguese vessels which had been taken by Captain Keeling because the Portuguese interfered with the English shipping at Surat. The Englishmen, however, did not get their licenses sealed this time without considerable delay. One reason given by the shogun's secretary was the report that there were seminary priests at Adams' house at Uraga. Adams sent away an express with a letter to his wife to look to it that there were no such matter. Cox's interpreter, Gorezano, also seems to have done his best to damage Adams by speaking against him at the court. He was at the court all day on September the 11th, but returned without anything. This treatment, so unlike that experienced at the hands of Ieyasu, was indicative of the different attitude of Hidetada towards foreigners. Later, Cuemon Dono, the secretary, used Captain Adams kindly and told him and the other two how the emperor was much offended against the padres, and therefore advised us not to have conversation with them. He willed Captain Adams not to think it long we were not dispatched, the emperor's business being such as yet it could not be done, but within a day or two he hoped to end it to our content. The privileges and goshons, however, were not received till September 23rd, Adams having paid daily visits to the court in the interval. On one of these days, September the 18th, he had much talk with Shongo Dono, the admiral's son, in which they discussed the economic value of the islands to the north of Japan, as well as that of the Ladrones and Hermosa. Hermosa is Formosa, Taiwan. Hermosa was the beautiful island in Spanish. Adams was asked whether he would go as pilot to a Japanese expedition for the conquest of the Northern Islands, but he replied that he was not at his own disposal, being servant to the English nation, and therefore could not serve two masters. This answer seems quite to refute Cox's charge of a year ago that Adams was trying to make an excuse to leave the company's service. The party left Edo on September 26th and was entertained at Adams's house at Febe, Hemi, for the night. Cox says, this Febe, Hemi, is a lordship given to Adams per the old emperor, the old shogun, that's Ieyasu, to him and his forever, and confirmed to his son called Joseph. There is above 100 farms or households upon it, besides others under them, all which are his vassals, and he hath power of life and death over them, they being his slaves, and he has absolute authority over them, as any Tono or king in Japan hath over his vassals. Japon, sorry. On their departure, the chief of the town sent many servants to accompany them to Uraga, 8 or 9 miles off, all running before us on foot as homages to Captain Adams. A messenger now came from Wickham to tell Cox that proclamation had been made at Miyako, Kyoto, Osaka, and Sakai, forbidding the Japanese to buy any merchandise from foreigners. This was a terrible blow to Cox, who returned at once to Yedo, where he and Adams made every endeavour to have the order revoked, but in vain. In future, the English trade was to be restricted to Hirado and Nagasaki. In the letter book of Jacques Specx, chief of the Dutch factory, preserved in the Rijkarchief at the Hague, there is a Dutch version of a letter which Adams wrote to Specx on October the 14th, giving him an account of these transactions. In it, he expresses his willingness to render services to the Dutch whenever these should be required. As his contract with the English company did not expire until December 14th, it might appear as if this savoured of double dealing, but his third year's service was on a different basis from that of the first two, and in any case it was nearly ended. Moreover, the Hague records show that the Dutch company in 1614 had lent Mrs. Adams 200 guilders, provided that she handed them letters of favour and recommendation addressed to her husband, who was no doubt anxious to repay the obligation. Once more, the party set out from Yedo, October 17th, Adams appointing someone to sell whatever he could of the company's goods at Yedo. He himself accompanied Cox on the journey back to Hirado. At Yui, his horse was frightened by a bird flying out of a hedge, which caused the captain to fall backwards and put his right shoulder bone out of joint, and 1,000 to 1 that he had not broke his neck. He was left behind at Shrongo, that's Suruga, for 4 or 5 days, as he feared his arm would go out of joint again, rejoining Cox at Miyako on November the 2nd, being well amended yet not without pain in his shoulder. They reached Hirado on December the 3rd after transacting business at Sakai, south of Osaka, and other places en route, and visited the king with a present 2 days later. Cox again fell out with Adams about this time and wrote in his diary, December the 11th, 1616, Captain Adams entered into extraordinary humours, taking the part of the scrivener of his junk with one Miguel, 2 villains that have cozened the company against me and all the rest of all the English to maintain them before the justice. Possibly the banquet and usual entertainment by kabokes, Cabokes, or actresses, to which Adams invited all the English 4 days later, was by way of amendment. The Sea Adventure, having left for Siam with Eaton on board, that's Eaton, Adams departed for Nagasaki on January the 1st, 1617, to buy cables and sails for Jiquan's junk, which he had bought for 700 taels, and in which he had resolved to go to Cochin China. For this he received a sharp letter from the king of Hirado, the daimyo, who was displeased because the timber required was not bought from him and threatened not to let Adams have carpenters. He also effected a grievance on the grounds that the junk was brought to Hirado without his permission. These were some of the many indications of the Englishman's waning influence. The junk was one in which Edward Saris returned from Siam. Yes, Edward Saris, not John Saris. So there are two Sarises here. It was lying at Satsuma and was brought to Hirado on February the 10th. On February the 4th, Cox settled with Adams for his 3 years' service rendered to the East India Company at the rate of £100 per annum. So that would be £300, would it not? Adams's preparations for his next voyage were now almost completed. The inevitable present was taken to the king on March the 9th with a request for a letter of favour to the king of Cochin China. He also accompanied Cox with a present to Cuemon Dono, the Chief Justice, in respect of a dispute with the purser of the junk in which Saris returned from Siam. On March the 19th, he took his junk out to Kawachi. This is March the 19th, 1616, is it not, I believe? Took his junk out to Kawachi, but was called back under false pretence of an order from the king. A fresh start was then made, but contrary winds drove him back to the harbour. Here he was violently assaulted by some of Cuemon Dono's relatives, who were apparently angered by Adams' refusal to meet their exorbitant demands in the matter of the share of the timber from Siam. One of them laid hold on his arms and wrung them in such extreme sort that he put him to much pain. He was moved to take out the shogun's pass, kissing it and holding it above his head. It was decided, however, not to make any formal complaint to the king for the present. On March the 23rd, the junk, which Adams had named the Gift of God, got away, and the record of the voyage is given in the log, page 224. The voyage lasted till April 20th, on which day the junk entered the river of Quangnam, and sailed up to the town. Shortly afterwards, Adams began to make inquiries concerning the fate of the two Englishmen, Caerwarden and Peacock, who had lost their lives there 3 years before. In spite of his persistent efforts, little fresh information could be obtained, and no redress for the loss of the company's goods. A full account of the negotiations is given by Edward Saris in his log of the same voyage, as well as of the cunning way in which 656 taels, which he was about to pay for silk, were stolen from him. See page 295. Robbery and murder were common events in Cochin China. The return journey was begun on July the 1st, the Goto Islands being reached on August the 2nd. The latter part of the voyage was stormy, Saris speaking of exceeding storm or typhoon, August the 1st. Adams on the same day records that 13 corposants, or St. Elmo's fires, were seen 3 different times. Adams's report to Cox of this latest venture was that he had found but a losing voyage. He added that the king of Cochin China is well contented our nation shall trade into his country. The junk was towed into Hirado on August the 11th, and Adams came to visit Cox, the latter not being well, and told him that the king of Cochin China knew nothing of the murdering of Peacock. A few days later, Adams was again assaulted by one of the Japanese recently returned from England, who took him by the throat in his own lodging because he would not stand out for them that all the money they received impres at Captain Saris being here was given them gratis. Adams seems to have been through some fairly tough times. Well, not only up to the point where he was shipwrecked in Japan. Though out of the company's employ, Adams continued to help Cox as much as he could. That's the East India Company's employ. Accompanying him in his, and the next page goes to the, okay, there's a couple of footnotes here. Gift of God, the junk named the Gift of God, probably after a vessel of this name, which in 1588 formed part of the same fleet of supply ships, of one of which Adams was captain. That would be the Richard Duffield he was captain of in 1588 when the Spanish Armada came to England. So anyway, let's continue. Though out of the company's employ, Adams continued to help Cox as much as he could, accompanying him in his own bark on the journey to make the customary present to the emperor. They set out on August 26, 1617, and were both ill the first night or two of their journey, having eaten or drunk something that was not good. Cox reached Osaka on September the 4th, but Adams did not arrive till September the 8th, his bark having sprung a leak at Takasago, that's in Hyogo Prefecture, endangering his life and spoiling all his goods. The next day they left for Miyako, Kyoto, and shortly afterwards visited the king of Hirado, the daimyo of Hirado, who was staying there. That would be Matsura Hoin, I think. The latter used Adams respectively in extraordinary sort. The reason he gathered was for fear we should complain against him as the Hollands had done. He afterwards sent him a very fair katabra for a present, with words of compliments. Katabra would that be a katana, a sword? The next few days, Adams spent in journeys to the court to try and get the privileges of the English enlarged, remaining there all day without food. An embassy from Korea was on a visit to the shogun at the same time, and this partly accounted for the delay. Then the King of England's letter was returned for a translation into Japanese to be made, and when this was done, the answer was given on September the 23rd that no larger privileges would be given to the English than to other strangers, namely to sell at Hirado or Nagasaki. Even then, exception was taken by the shogun's councillor to the inclusion of Nagasaki, which was finally struck out, it being understood that goods might be sold there, but no English ships should go to that harbour. The following 7 days were spent in final negotiations and in waiting for the signatures to the passports for Siam and Cochin China. Cox desired Adams to try and obtain permission for English shipping to put into Goto or Satsuma in case it were necessary to leave Hirado on account of the increasing difficulties caused by the unfriendliness of the king of that place, the daimyo, as well as of the Dutch, but in this also he was unsuccessful. Adams's influence at court had disappeared on the death of Ieyasu. 10 coats were all that he received from Hidetada by way of a present. On October the 3rd, he accompanied Cox on his visit to the king of Hirado to complain of the treatment which they had received at his capital. The king, the daimyo, gave them good words, promising that all should be amended on his return. The present of damask, pictures, and musk cods, which Cox sent to Mrs. Adams, her son and daughter, does not seem an extravagant return for the services rendered by the pilot, by Adams. Yeah. 2 pieces of taffeta were added a few days later. On their return journey at Osaka, they began to make preparations for another trading voyage to Siam. 150 taels were advanced to Adams to invest in merchandise, and Wickham was sent to Sakai to make purchases and inquire about sales. An attempt to buy armour and guns was unsuccessful, their sale being prohibited to strangers, though the governor of Nagasaki promised to be blind if 3 or 4 were bought through their native agent. Be blind as in turn a blind eye, I think. But the governor died a few days later. Oh, okay. Adams at this time wished to sell his junk, and Cox wrote to the Chinese captain about it, October 19, 1617. Up to November 18th, no offer was made for it of more than 1,000 taels, including the passport, but on the 26th, the Chinaman bought it for 1,200 taels. Adams stayed behind at Osaka to collect money owing to the company, while Cox left for Hirado, arriving there on November 17th. He sent 3,300 taels in advance by 2 messengers and wrote 4 or 5 letters to Cox. He himself arrived at Hirado on December 22nd, bringing 1,200 taels collected from Tozaemon Dono of Sakai and 500 from Grub Street, Cuemon Dono, Grub Street, their agent at Osaka, Cuemon Dono. All he could get out of the latter, though Cox had advised Adams to sue him before the justice. The latter part of the journey had been stormy, and he had to come overland from Langway, Nagoya. The dangers and delays of these journeys to the court more than justified Adams's warning against establishing the factory at Hirado. His relations with Cox seem to have been very cordial at this time, and his services as useful as when he was in the company's pay. The day after his arrival, he put off to bid the Dutch General Lamb farewell in place of Cox, who was unwell. On this occasion, one of the Dutchman's saluting guns burst, damaging the ship and wounding some of the crew, causing 2 of them to fall into the sea and a third into a Japanese boat, shaking its bottom out. There's a reference to Ries, History of the English Factory at Hirado, page 19, which goes back to... Where's that? Establishing the factory at Hirado, yeah. Right, so on this occasion, one of the Dutchman's saluting guns burst, damaging the ship and wounding some of the crew, causing 2 of them to fall into the sea and a third into a Japanese boat, shaking its bottom out. Yet, in the end, all turned into laughter and mocking of those 3 men. Oh, that's good. Early in the next year, 1618, Adams was again assaulted in Hirado, a slave of Toncha-sama's wife, knocking the lantern out of his hand as he was returning from supper with Cox. The Sea Adventure had just started for Siam in charge of Eaton when Nikwan, the Chinaman, came from Nagasaki to ask Adams, who had sold his own junk, to go as pilot of a Chinese junk to Cochin China, January the 8th. Adams had, however, gone to Nagasaki, whither Cox sent a letter urging him to go with the Chinese rather than with the Japanese. He returned on January the 14th, the journey from Nagasaki occupying 4 days on account of the bad weather, and after some haggling with regard to shares, agreed to go to Cochin China. The friendly relations between Adams and Cox, which had been marked by a frequent exchange of presents, were again interrupted through the former taking the part of the merchant Groby Dono in a dispute about the payment for some silk. Captain Adams, Cox records on February the 1st, fell into extreme terms this day about Groby Dono, he which falsified the writing, taking his part against me and all the English. I never saw him in the like humour. A week later, however, they met at breakfast to celebrate the recovery of health of Miguel, the Korean interpreter, who had formerly been in the service of Adams, and on the 13th they went together to the king of Hirado, the daimyo. In an unprinted letter of March the 7th, Cox mentions having given Adams 1 tael for his pains going up with us to the emperor's court. Certainly a none too liberal reward. 1 tael was not much. The Chinese junk belonging to Sichuan was now ready and started for Cochin China on March the 17th from Fukuda near Nagasaki, having on board Adams as pilot, Edward Saris and Robert Hawley as agents for the company, and Chimpao, a Chinaman, as captain. The account of this voyage can be read in Adams's words, page 242, below, presumably. Saris, in his letter to Cox, tells how they put into Nauru, one of the Goto Islands, and the ground being bad were driven upon the rocks, lost their rudder, and split the sternpost. The season was a bad one, nearly all the junks which set out about this time having to seek shelter, and this year's trading seemed to promise even less than usual. On April 25th, Cox received a letter from Adams by way of Nagasaki telling of the extremity they passed in losing of their rudder, and a fortnight later, Andrea Dittis, the Chinese captain, returned from that place, informed him that Adams had returned there, and that the Sea Adventure was at Ryukyu, Okinawa, having lost her voyage for Siam. So Andrea Dittis, of course, was not his real name, but he was a Chinese captain. On May the 14th, Adams and his company returned to Hirado, having failed to refit the junk in the Ryukyu Islands. On July 20th, Adams told Cox that the Dutch had asked him to go to Yedo with Captain Barkhout to take a present to the shogun, as John Jourdain, their countryman, who usually went with them, was out of favour at court by means of his foul tongue. He was invited to dinner on board the Dutch ship and received a salute of much ordnance. Cannons, many cannons, I suppose, or many guns salute. No doubt they were very glad to have him in their service again. They set out on the 31st, and a week later the disquieting news reached Cox that an English vessel had been captured by the Dutch and was then outside Hirado. He at once laid a complaint with the authorities and began to make preparations for a journey to Yedo to inform the shogun of this latest act of piracy, as he deemed it, on the part of the Hollanders. Express messengers were also sent to recall Adams from his service with the enemy. Specx, the head of the Dutch, offered to restore the ship to Cox, but the latter indignantly refused all overtures. A letter was received from Adams on August 19th, telling of the wreck of many barks, he having not then heard of the Dutch aggression. But a fortnight later, Cox, who had reached Shimonoseki on his way to the court, had his own letter returned by Adams, with such an unseasonable and unreasonable letter as I little suspected he would have done, saying he was none of the company's servant, and is, as it seemeth, altogether Hollandized, persuading me not to go up about this matter. Further letters were sent to Adams on September the 7th by Cox and Nielsen to try and dissuade him from accompanying the Dutch, but when they reached Osaka, Grub Street, Cuemon Dono, informed them Grub Street. Why did he get that name? Informed them that Adams had said that Cox had no reason to complain against the Hollanders as he did. Cox thought that Cuemon was playing the Gemini, and per instigation of Captain Adams, both taking the Hollanders' parts for lucre. If it be proved so, he adds, God reward them according to their deservings, and God deliver us from friendly secret foes. September 13th. His hopes of success in his mission must have been considerably lessened when he heard a week or so later that the Hollanders had delivered their present and had audience the same day. Adams met them on October the 4th, 10 leagues from Yedo, but Cox does not describe what passed between them. The former's children also met him a little later and offered a banquet. Adams returned with Cox and went to the court to know when the English could have audience, but found so many noblemen giving presents, it being a festival day, that they were put off until the next day. Thus Adams tried to serve both masters. 2 days later he was kept waiting at court from noon to night and had no word spoken to him, but the following day the present was offered. Presents were also given to the shogun's eldest son and certain high officials. For a month and a half, Adams was in almost daily attendance at the court, waiting for their dispatch and a license for another journey to Cochin China. A nod and a smiling countenance were all that he could get on most days. On one of these idle days, October 26, Nielsen asked him for 10 Shire maps, which by his account were still in his charge, but he fell into such a chafe about that matter, telling them which were about him in the Japon tongue that this was not the first time we had charged him with false accounts and after reckonings. Afterwards he calmed down and asked Cox about the matter, not denying his obligation. A great comet was at this time exciting the whole country. The Jesuit father, in his annual letter of 1618, relates that there appeared in Yedo, where the emperor's court is, a comet shaped like a naginata or Japanese scimitar, with a perfect cross at its foot. The emperor was so alarmed at this that he put off his journey, though he was on the point of leaving Miyako. He called the English pilot, who had lived there many years, and asked him what these omens meant. The latter replied that generally they were signs of war, but this would take place in Europe. The heretic, says the Jesuit, would have had good reason for frightening him, for they were ominous signs of divine chastisement prepared for the emperor, because he was a persecutor of the Christian faith. However, he did not do anything else, for he was a deadly enemy of the Catholics. Cox left Yedo on November the 18th, leaving Adams to get the license and bring it after him. He gave presents to Adams of cloth and damask, as well as to Mrs. Adams and their children. So Mrs. Adams is the Japanese wife, Oyuki, I think, must be. Adams overtook him at Osaka, but had not got the license. The alleged reason for the delay was that the last one, granted to the English, had been sold and had caused trouble between the Chinese and Japanese in Cochin China. He accompanied Cox on part of his journey and sent him 50 loaves of bread. From January the 14th, 1619 to December the 5th, 1620, there is a gap in the manuscript of Cox's diary, and the occasional correspondence is also scanty for this period, but in a letter of February 24th, 1619, Cox mentions that Adams was going with his license in Semi Dono's junk for Tonkin. From the logbook we learn that Adams started on this last voyage in a new junk on March the 16th, 1619, reaching Tonkin on April the 14th, thanks be to Almighty God for it. On the outward journey, during which he rescued a shipwrecked native, whom they found clinging to a plank, the junk sailed round Hainan, but the return was made through the straits. The last 10 leagues before they reached Tonkin took them nearly 8 days to accomplish, the wind being contrary. Adams stayed in Tonkin 3 months, spending much time in negotiations with the king's son, a eunuch being the intermediary. A certain amount of trading was done, silk being the commodity most desired. He built houses ashore for their accommodation, being careful to make a ditch round them. Business was, as usual, not carried on without some disputes, and at one time they had to shut the gates of their premises. His merchants were evidently cautious men and loath to part with their money in advance, for the Tonkinese were tricky customers. Tonkinese, I think these are the Vietnamese, are they not? They did so ultimately, but apparently failed to get any silk in return from the king's son. In the intervals, Adams busied himself with superintending the making of ropes and tow and the pitching of the orlop or lower deck. He notes also that some country people fell among thieves and were wounded, and later that a thief was executed for stealing. On the return journey, which began on July 16th, the junk struck a rock in the Straits of Hainan, but was not damaged. Thanks be to God forever, who preserved us miraculously. Adams carefully records depths in the various parts of the straits, possibly with a view for future voyages. After clearing the straits, he made for the southern point of Formosa, Taiwan, as we call it now, and then proceeded up the eastern side of the island. The log ends on August 22nd, when they were some 60 leagues north of the island, and except for a few accounts and a short vocabulary, the rest of the manuscript is blank. Shortly after his arrival at Hirado, Cox left for the court, expecting Adams to follow him, but Eaton, writing on September the 8th, says that he knows not when Captain Adams will go up, in that he is sickly and minded to take physic. Medicine, I think that is. Physic. The same correspondent informed Cox on September 25th that Adams had been the means of the escape of 2 English prisoners from the Dutch ship Angel, or Angel, a service which Cox recorded in his letter of March 10th, 1620, to the East India Company. In a letter of February 18th, 1620, Cox mentions that Adams helped him in negotiating with the governor of Nagasaki about the price of lead. And 2 days later, he wrote that, oh dear, what's going on? Can't seem to get, oh, there we go. Cuemon Dono hath made a brabbling here at Nagasaki, and told Captain Adams we owe him for the 2 bar Oban gold, which the China captain had. It is a lardy-mouthed man, and would, if he could, set debate betwixt Captain Adams and us, but it is not in his power to do it. Adams died on May the 16th, 1620, probably at Hirado, according to Rees, English Factory at Hirado, page 95. The nature of his fatal illness is unknown. Cox, writing to the company on December 13th, says, and our good friend Captain William Adams, who was so long before us in Japan, departed out of this world the 16th of May last. Particulars of his will are given in volume 6 of the Japan Society's Transactions, pages 346 to 7. Writing again on the next day, Cox adds, I cannot but be sorrowful for the loss of such a man as Captain William Adams was, he having been in such favour with 2 emperors of Japan, 2 shoguns that is, as never was any Christian in these parts of the world, etc. It is interesting to recall Adams's views on death expressed in his letter of January the 12th, 1613. Nevertheless, it is the lot of all flesh, in this life many troubles and afflictions, and in the end death. Therefore it is a blessed thing to die in the Lord, with a faithful trust in God, for they rest from their labours, etc. Cox tried to look after the interests of Adam's son Joseph and daughter Susanna during the 2 or 3 years that he remained in Japan. These are his children with Oyuki, his Japanese wife. I think, surely. Yes. He discovered that their uncle Andrea was negotiating on his own account for the sale of the privileges granted to Adams and bequeathed to his children, and that Jinkese, Adams's servant, had received money due to them without Cox's knowledge. He entered a suit against them and wrote to Adams' Japanese widow about their knavery, but the result is not recorded. Knavery. Good old English word. At the end of the year, December 29th, 1621, Cox delivered Adams's swords, 2 katana and a wakidashi, to Joseph, the pilot's son, to whom they had been left. Tears were shed at the delivery. The estate at Hemi was also part of Joseph's inheritance, but he was often at Yedo and continued to engage in foreign trade till 1632, when he disappears from notice. Adams's Japanese wife, daughter of Magome Kageu, a woman of some importance, her name was Oyuki, I think, died in August 1634. Their tombs or monuments were discovered in 1872 by Mr. Walter on a hill in Hemimura, about a mile from Yokosuka, and are preserved as a memorial. Anjincho, a street in the Nihonbashi district in Tokyo, also preserves the memory of the famous English pilot, but in England there is no memorial, not even in his native place, of one who by his energy and resourcefulness carried afar the fame of England, and in his relations with the ruler of Japan foreshadowed the alliance now existing between the two island races. This is during the time of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which began in 1902 and ended in 1921. Yeah. Yes, and Adams's grave is now established as being in Hirado, not Hemimura. At the conclusion of the paper, a vote of thanks was tendered to the author on the motion of Sir Claude M. MacDonald, who had been the ambassador after Ernest Sato, so from 1900 to 1912, I think, the ambassador in Tokyo. Seconded by Mr. Kato Naoshi, no doubt. I think he must have been Japanese ambassador in London. Sir Claude referred to the ceremony of consecrating the grave reputed to be that of William Adams and his Japanese wife on the cliff above Yokosuka Harbour, and mention was made of the clearing up of the ground around it at the expense of a large body of subscribers. It was felt that Gillingham in Kent had manifested but a lukewarm interest in the proposal to place in that parish a memorial to William Adams, which had been mooted at a meeting of the Japan Society and energetically pushed by Mr. Arthur Diosy, who related at length the attempts made in that direction without any success. Sir Wyndham Murray, chairman of the council, sent a letter expressing his regrets at being unable to attend the meeting as he was engaged in taking some of the wounded soldiers for sea trips in the Solent. Remember, this is during the First World War. Mr. Purnell explained that in all documents with which he is acquainted, Adams spelt his name William or W.M., and he thought it best to conform to this spelling rather than to adopt the familiar form, Will, in other words, W-I-L-L, found in previous papers read before the Japan Society. And we don't normally call him Will Adams anymore, it's William Adams. I think Will was a Victorian conceit. Okay, I think we can stop that share. I think, though, I would like one frustration with all this is so many place names are mentioned, and I think it would be quite useful to take a look at maps. So I've got 3 maps which I want to show you. Hang on a minute. We've got the voyage of the Liefde and the Japanese places, or Japan, the map of Japan, and another of Southeast Asia or East Asia. So where should we begin? These are all from Frederick Crane's latest book, In the Service of the Shogun, which I really should. Let's see, can I show it to you? Try to show it to you. I'm not sure, I've got all these windows in the way, so I'm not sure if I'm actually, yeah, okay. I think you can probably see that. In the Service of the Shogun, 2024. The Real Story of William Adams, Frederick Cranes. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation of, or Cranes maybe. He's at Nichibunken in Kyoto, professor there. All right, so let's take a look at the maps in his book, which are very good indeed. So if I can just, hold on. How are we going to do the share? Yes, there they are. Right, so start with East and Southeast Asia. Here we are. We've got the Moluccas, the Spice Islands. We've got Philippines, Ayutthaya, which is mentioned in the text I've just read. The Ryukyu Islands, also mentioned, and Hirado, of course, and Edo. Okay, so that's that. Let's go to the next one. Sorry. We can stop that share and share the next map. Japan. There we are. Yeah. So, yes, Hirado and Goto Islands here in Nagasaki Prefecture, off Kyushu. Shimonoseki was mentioned in the text. It's here where if you can see my cursor. Hemi is the Miura Peninsula up by Edo and Uraga. Sekigahara is where the battle took place in 1600. What else? Yeah, Tanegashima is famous for the arrival of muskets, I think, from Europe for the first time. The Seto Inland Sea, and Sakai is the port south of Osaka. And there's Kyoto or Miyako just up there. Okay, so hopefully that will help. And we've got one more to share, if I can find it. Again, that's from Frederick Kriens' book. Where are we? Okay, this one is The Voyage of the Liefde in 1600, or 1599 and 1600. How Adams got to Japan. So leaving from Rotterdam via the Downs, which is off the coast of Kent. It's a good mooring place. And the Cape Verde Islands, Cape Lopez, Annobon, through the Straits of Magellan and Santa Maria, Chile, where they had a fairly hostile reception, I think. By the time they were sailing across the Pacific, I think there were only 2 ships of 5 left. And then one of those was lost. So it was only the Liefde which actually landed in Kyushu, in the Bay of Beppu at a place called Usuki, in fact. All right. So I hope that helps a bit with the geography of things. You might wish to refer to this again. Okay. Well, thank you very much if you've persevered as far as here. It's quite confusing in parts, but I think you can get the general idea of the personalities involved. Cox, Adams, and the others, the Dutch and the Spanish. All right, so thank you very much, and I will stop here. See you next time. Goodbye.